Thank you. Can you hear me? All right. So I'm going to tell you tonight about a story about my proudest accomplishment. Before I knew I had OCD, or obsessive compulsive disorder, I was an undergraduate student at Penn State. I left Penn State immediately upon moving to campus. There were so many nice people, smart people, interesting things to learn, and activities to explore. I was a kid, or a college student, in an intellectual candy store, and I loved it. I spoke to my mom regularly on the phone. I told her excitedly about my classes, professors, and new friends, and she encouraged me to continue exploring my interests, study hard, and dream big. My siblings and grandparents, too, supported every new goal and endeavor I pursued all throughout my 4 years at Penn State. My greatest accomplishment, though, wasn't any of the goals I achieved, awards I received, or challenges that I enthusiastically pursued. My greatest accomplishment was learning a lesson that no one advised me or encouraged me to seek. But it is also an experience that I cherish and will retain for the rest of my life. In my first semester of college as an English major, I took a biology course to fulfill a gen ed requirement. On the first exam in the course, I got a D. I was devastated. I called my grandma after getting this grade and anxiously catastrophized the horrifying consequences. I was worried that I would fail the course, get a low GPA, lose my scholarship support, flunk out of college, never find a job, not have a future, be considered stupid, just catastrophized everything. If I had been seeing a therapist at the time, I may have noticed the cognitive distortions at work here. Perhaps I would have picked up on the assumptions I made, how these fears that I had weren't realistic, and how if they did occur, they weren't insurmountable obstacles. My grandma lovingly reassured me that I would be okay, that I could study harder for the next test and improve my grade. She was right. I studied differently for the next test. I got an A, I ended up with an A in the course, and then I ended up finishing the semester with what I considered a perfect 4.0 GPA. What persisted from this experience, however, was not self-confidence or a permanent label, smart. What persisted from the experience was obsessive thinking and the cycle of fear that enabled it. From this point forward, every assignment, paper, or exam elicited the same catastrophizing. So, for every assignment, I feared, what if I fail this? What if I fail the course? What if my GPA is so low that I lose my scholarship support? What if I never finish college? What if I never get a job? What if I'm stupid? What if no one likes me? All these what-if scenarios. This catastrophizing propelled me to not only complete assignments on time and study for exams, but also to ruminate over my fears and to perfect every task that I was assigned and to sacrifice my health and well-being in the process. I regularly forgot to eat. I drank coffee at midnight so that I could work throughout the night. I barely slept. I spent hours editing papers and re-editing papers, and I had a hard time ultimately turning them in. I canceled plans with friends if I felt like I needed more time to study. I cried, and sometimes I had panic attacks. I tried to ease the what-if scenarios in my brain. I thought that earning anything besides an A would lead to disaster. I developed the notion that every single semester I had to get a 4.0 or there would be devastating consequences. I didn't know that by feeding this cycle of anxiety with this particular response, that I was actually cultivating, fueling, and strengthening OCD. Now, in my last semester at Penn State, I enrolled in a really fun course called Adventure Literature. We read books about hiking, nature, camping, kayaking, and on the weekends we did some of these things together as a class. Also in my last semester of college, however, I felt exhausted. My energy had waned as a result of how much had been expended over the last 4 years to satisfy OCD. I experienced panic attacks regularly, I became depressed, and I started to have suicidal thoughts. I had difficulty functioning and felt no pleasure in anything. As a result of this, I was hospitalized for a week in my last semester in an inpatient psychiatric facility. Thankfully, this hospitalization eventually led to my diagnosis and treatment. I began taking medication for anxiety and depression and started attending outpatient therapy sessions a few times a week. My anxiety started to shift. So I stopped worrying so much about finishing my last semester with that perfect 4.0 GPA, and instead focused more on passing my classes, getting 8 hours of sleep, eating 3 meals a day, and just general survival. The last week of the semester, I checked my grades online. I ended up with a B, the first of my college career in adventure literature. Aside from slight disappointment, I noticed no other consequences. I still passed that semester with the same amount of student debt I would have accrued otherwise. I still graduated. In the months that followed, I interviewed for jobs, I received offers, and I started my first full-time job. I had friends, and no one seemed to treat me any differently. All the things I feared would happen didn't happen. In other words, the world or my world didn't end when I got a B. It might be obvious to others that getting a B would not necessarily lead to all the consequences that I feared. But because I had fed the fear repeatedly and for years by doing everything I could to avoid that feared consequence, I actually gave power to it. I strengthened it to the extent that those fears had power over me, which is often, unfortunately, the cycle of OCD that gets perpetuated unless we disrupt it with exposure and response prevention. Now that I know I have OCD, and after participating in psychotherapy and exposure and response prevention over the years, this makes sense. I was exposed to a huge fear, and while it didn't necessarily feel good, it also didn't result in the consequences that had plagued my mind and perpetuated my OCD for years. The lesson that I learned from this experience is that being imperfect is okay. It's more than okay. It's inevitable, it's factual, it's part of being human, it's okay. I've carried this with me through graduate school, and I share it with family members, friends, and clients now that I'm a therapist myself. It is also a reminder to myself as I re-entered academia this semester as a doctoral candidate. I want to share this lesson with you too. Anyone who might be living with OCD or loving someone who lives with OCD, who perhaps has their own notions of what it means to be perfect. Getting a B in adventure literature, failing in the eyes of my OCD, and experiencing the parallel and perilous adventure of OCD alongside my adventure literature class, this is my proudest